Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson, Chapter 5. The Rationale of Fascination. In this chapter I shall proceed to lay before you the rationale of fascination, that is, an exposition of the principles of its operation. While the phenomena of fascination extends over a very wide area or field, there is still to be found a certain unity of principle of operation underlying all of the forms and phases. From this point of view, we may speak of the science of fascination as well as of the philosophy of fascination. The fundamental principle. The fundamental principle of the operation of the mental phenomena known as fascination is found in the theory of mentative induction, as stated in my work on Mental Magic, and which is briefly stated in the first chapter of the present book. This theory, you will remember, holds that each individual mind is a center of mentative energy, and that the mentative energy of an individual mind may be, and is, transmitted from one person to another by means of mentative waves or currents. That these mentative waves or currents tend to induce in the minds of other persons the emotions or feelings existing in the mental states of the person sending out the waves or currents. In this connection we must also remember that there are two mental poles, known as the motive and emotive poles respectively. The motive pole manifesting as willpower, and the emotive pole manifesting as desire force. Desire force acts in the direction of drawing, pulling, attracting, luring, coaxing, charming, etc., while willpower acts in the direction of compelling, forcing, driving, impelling, commanding, demanding, etc. Desire force always draws its object towards itself, while willpower always overpowers and compels its object, generally in the sense of driving it into action. Mentative induction. This mentative induction acts along similar lines to the induction of electricity and magnetism, that is, it sets up similar states in the object affected. And the resemblance is even still further marked when we consider that the phenomena of electricity closely resemble the action of the will, inasmuch as both tend to drive outward in the form of an impelling force, and that the phenomena of magnetism resemble the action of desire, inasmuch as both tend to draw inward in the form of an attracting energy. An interesting question. In this connection, however, I would direct the attention of the student to one fact concerning the effect of induced states, which some have failed to grasp in my teachings in my work on Mental Magic. The matter may be stated by the inquiry of a student of the last mentioned work, who inquires as follows: "Please inform me how it is that an induced mental state reproduces the original mental state of the mentator in the following case. A man desires to have another perform a certain act, and sends a mentative current which acts by induction on the mind of the second person, setting up an induced mental state therein. The second person then performs the act desired by the first person. Now, if the induced mental state was the same as the original one, would not the second party simply also desire that the first party should do the act, just as the first party desired that the second should do it? But it does not work so, for the second party does not so desire, but instead merely desires to do just what the first party desired him to do. That is, he feels within himself a desire to do that which the first party desires shall be done. It seems to me that the induced state is really the opposite of the original state. Please set me straight on this." The answer. I am very glad to have the opportunity to set straight my students on this point. A careful examination will show that both states are similar. For instance, A desires that B shall do a certain thing, and induces a similar state in B. The induced state produces in B a like desire that the things shall be done as he proceeds to do it. No opposite action here, is there? The essence of the desire in both cases is the same, namely, that the thing shall be done. The expression of the feeling of the two persons in the case as 1. I desire that you shall do, and 2. I desire to do, respectively, are merely the personal forms of expression, and not the essence of the desire or feeling. The desire or feeling in its real essence is, I desire this thing done. And both hold the same desire, A holding the original desire or feeling, and B the induced desire or feeling. Think this over a little until you see the point. Induced will acts in the same way as the above mentioned instance of the action of the induced desire. Of course, in all cases of the action of desire, the will is also called into operation. In the above cited case it works as follows. A feels the desire to have the thing done, and so his will is called into operation to concentrate the mentative currents, and to project them to a focused point on the mind of B. Then B, feeling the induced desire that the thing shall be done, awakens his will and does the thing. Do you see this also? You had better fix this process firmly in your minds, for it is the key to the operation of the principle of fascination and other mentative phenomenon. Making another feel like doing. Now to get back to the first principle, which is that one person may make a second person feel like doing a thing that the first person wishes to have done. That is the thing in a nutshell. And in the degree that the second person so feels like doing the thing, so will be the degree of desire and will induced in him, and consequently so will be the likelihood of his actually doing it. You see, the matter of feeling like is at the bottom of it all. And this being so, it is readily seen that if one is able to induce a state of feeling like in another, he has the secret of the control of the other person's actions. Now this is the basis of mental fascination. Now let us see how this principle works out in a case of mesmerism or hypnotism, so called, which after all is but a phase of mental fascination, governed by the above-mentioned principle. I prefer the term mesmerism for several reasons, among them being the fact that it is a recognition of Mesmer, its discoverer or rediscoverer, and also the fact that hypnotism means sleep, while mesmerism covers the whole phenomena in both its waking or sleep conditions. A case of mesmerism. Well, let us suppose a case of mesmerism. The mesmerist, whom I will call the operator, faces the subject. The operator assumes a positive state of mind, his willpower being active and concentrated, practice having improved him along these lines. The subject naturally assumes a negative mental state, opening his emotive mental pole to the influence of the mind or will of the operator, and allowing his motive mental pole to remain quiescent or relaxed. That is to say, he opens his desire mind to the influence of the operator, and lets his will remain inactive and relaxed. The operator desires and wills that the subject be influenced, and the subject agrees, consciously or unconsciously, to be so influenced. One wills, and the other is willing, which latter paradoxical expression means that he is not willing. The operator naturally asserts his positivity, while the subject assumes a decided state of negativity. One asserts a supremacy of will, and the other submits. I would call your attention to the fact that there is no physical compulsion or influence in the matter, it is all a matter of mentation. And both parties fully recognize the reality of the phenomenon. The silent conflict. The above relative mental state of the two persons is apparent in a greater or lesser degree whenever two persons meet. One is always stronger mentatively than the other, and a silent conflict ensues from which one or the other emerges a victor, and the result is recognized and acquiesced in by both victor and vanquished. Ordinarily, however, the distinction is not nearly so marked or great as in the case of a strong mesmerist and his negative subject, the latter having probably been trained in negativity by repeated trials and experiments in private and in public. For know you, that even as positivity may be cultivated, developed, and strengthened by practice and actual performance, so, alas, may negativity be encouraged, developed, and made habitual by a continued practice of giving in to the will of another or others. It is all a matter of habit. Positive and negative. It will be seen at once that given a subject and operator bearing the stated degrees of relative positivity and negativity, the subject will have a tendency to accept and obey the wishes and commands of the operator with a minimum degree of resistance. The operator will strongly wish the subject to feel in a certain way and to act upon the feeling. To accomplish this result, he will concentrate his desire by his will, and then direct a combined and focused attack on the mind of the subject. He is likely to call suggestion to his aid in the attack, for by so doing he is able to obtain an additional advantage, for a suggestion, as I have stated in my work on Mental Magic, is a physical agent inducing mental states, or an outward and visible sign of an inward feeling or mental state, which tends to induce a similar feeling in the mind of accepting the suggestion. The suggestive command. The operator gives the subject in the suggestion by command, and in accordance with the phrase of suggestion known as suggestion through obedience. See my work on Mental Magic. The subject obeys. It must not be forgotten, however, that the suggestion is merely the outward symbol of the inward mental state of the operator, and becomes effective only by reason of this fact. The operator throws his intensified desire force and will power into the suggestion, and receives an effect along the line of the threefold activity. With his will he produces a dual effect, i.e., 1. He captivates the desire of the subject and induces in it the desired feeling-like state. 2. He takes captive the will of the subject and subjugates it to his own. And at the same time, by his desire he also produces a dual effect, i.e., 1. He induces a similar desire in the mind of the subject by mentative waves or currents, and 2. He allures or seduces the will of the subject by the strength of his desire. The result of this combined attack causes the mind of the subject to act as follows, which adds a third dual effect to the operation, i.e., 1. The subject's desire, being induced as stated by the operator, acts to influence his own will, thus making the latter fall in with the induced desire. 2. The subject's will, controlled as stated by the operator, acts upon its own desire, thus making the latter fall in with the seduced will. It must be remembered that the three mental operations above mentioned are concurrent, that is, they act at the same time, and exercise joint action and control upon the mind of the subject. And neither the operator nor the subject are necessarily conscious of there being three dual actions under way. The operator simply desires and wills, with or without suggestion, while the subject simply feels like, as before stated, and accepts the suggestion if one is given, without recognizing the various mental operations going on to produce the feeling like. The detailed explanation may make the operation seem complicated, while in reality it appears to both the operator and subject as quite a simple matter indeed. The daydream state. The above process is the same whether the operator merely produces the simplest result upon the subject, or whether he secures the most remarkable and startling exhibitions of the control of one mind by another. The principle of operation is the same in all cases. With sleep or without sleep it is the same. In fact, as we shall see, the very sleep condition is produced just as are the other effects, and its production merely tends to produce a daydream state in the subject, and thus makes him act in a daydream-like manner, with appropriate illusions. Sleep phenomena are merely one of the side issues of mesmerism when the true principle is understood. Habit and repetition. Habit and repetition. In our consideration of the operation of mesmerism, we must not forget the part that habit and repetition play in the matter. For instance, the operator may be able to produce only the simplest effects at first trial, but at each subsequent trial, in which he gains more and more control over the subject, and a greater acquiescence and degree of obedience, he is able to obtain a still more marked effect. If you will read my remarks on the suggestion by repetition in my work on Mental Magic, page 120, you will realize the awful force of repetition in habit, as well as the power of repeated statement. This psychological fact is like the operation of the wedge. Admit the thin edge, and each additional blow drives it further in. This works along the lines of both good and evil. Remember, the wise use it to their own strengthening, while the foolish allow it to be their undoing. Beware of the thin edge of the wedge of undesirable habits of thought and action. A psychological law. The mesmerist understands well, often too well, the nature and results of the above-mentioned psychological law. He has found out by experience that although it may be difficult to control a subject the first time, it will be easier the next, and so on until perfect control is obtained. And, knowing this, he bends his endeavors to inserting the very thinnest edge of the wedge, understanding that in this he has his hardest task before him. And alas, how many of us know that this same principle is in operation in everyday life, although seemingly having nothing to do with mesmerism? How many of us are able to regret the day of the entry of the thin edge of the wedge? Another point to be remembered is that the subject who is under a fair degree of control does not feel as if he were obeying the commands or wishes of the operator alone. That is, not in the main. It is true that he instinctively obeys the command of the suggestion, just as a horse quickens his gait when spoken to, or a soldier acts quickly in obedience to orders, etc., etc. But the motive for the action, or feeling, seems to come from within himself to a great degree. It has the force and effect of an instinctive action proceeding along subconscious lines. He seems to want to do the thing of his own accord. This is the dangerous feature. This, then, in a general way, is the rationale of mental fascination as shown in its phase of mesmerism, and its corresponding exhibitions along less pronounced lines. If you will acquaint yourselves with these principles of operation, you will have a grasp on the whole subject. In our next chapter we shall have a view of the mental states of operator and subject, which will throw additional light upon the subject before us. End of Chapter 5. Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson. Chapter 6. Impressionability. In the last chapter I laid before you an exposition of the principles of the operation of mental fascination, particularly in its phases of mesmerism. The student who has followed what I have said therein has seen that there must of necessity be a marked difference in the degree of impressionability or receptivity to mental induction, manifested by the operator and subject respectively, in order that the pronounced phenomena may be manifested. But this difference of degree of impressionability is manifested by all men and women. Between the one extreme point in the scale of impressionability to the other extreme there are many degrees, and each person has his or her own degree, subject, of course, to change by development. Magnetic positivity. I would like to quote from my work on mental magic, illustrating this last mentioned point. I have said therein, I do not mean that the degree of magnetic positivity is fixed permanently in either person, for the contrary is the case. One of the persons, who is really the stronger, usually, may be weaker at that particular moment, owing to his will being fatigued, or by reason of his having relaxed his will power, as often is the case. And in such case the defeated one may be the victor at the last encounter, or may even rally his energies a moment later, and thus turn the tables. One may have a strong will in moments of activity, and yet in moments of passivity he may relax it very much. And this is a still more important fact. One may so increase his will power that he will be able to completely dominate those who formerly overmastered and then overawed him. All of us know of instances of this kind in our own personal experience. The two extremes. At the extreme point of mental positivity are the wonderfully strong-willed men who are natural leaders and managers. At the extreme of negative mentative point are those people who are moved by every passing suggestion or mental current with which they may come in contact. Those impressionable people who seem to live in the emotional plane of their being, and who are always open to outside influences, and are like weathercocks moved by every passing breeze. These people are really the reflection of the thoughts, desires, and wills of others, the last person who catches their attention being the right one to follow. You all know the type, don't you? I do not mean by this that only persons naturally weak-willed may be mesmerized, but I do say that when strong-willed people allow themselves to be mesmerized, they must relax their wills and become passive or negative to the operator, else there will be no result gained. A strong-willed man may voluntarily relax and become negative in order to be mesmerized. I have seen this done in many cases, although I have always urged against it, for I consider it inadvisable for one to surrender his will in this way, even for the purpose of scientific investigation. I am sure that I would not do so myself, and therefore I cannot approve of the practice on the part of others. The artistic temperament. Then again, I have known people of a highly developed artistic temperament, such as actors, poets, artists, writers, and others who possessed strong wills, to allow themselves to become very impressionable by reason of their active imaginations. That is to say, they would allow themselves to be so carried away with the idea of being impressed that they would throw themselves into the part of the mesmerized subject, and actually mesmerize themselves, although allowing the operator to take the credit. This last explanation will throw light on a phase of phenomena that apparently presents an exception to the rule, but which, when viewed in the light of the above explanation, may be seen to come strictly within the rule of positivity and negativity. A mesmerist's trick. Public performers of mesmerism, when they meet with an imaginative subject whose will is too strong to subdue, often begin to bend their efforts toward arousing the imagination of the person, and thus causing him to become passive and in a subjective condition of acting out the part suggested by the operator. In such cases there is no conflict of wills whatever, but on the contrary, the subject wills to act out the part, and becomes the partner of the mesmerist instead of his opponent. The subject in such cases mesmerizes himself, and voluntarily allows himself to be led by the suggestions of the operator, so long as the suggestions are not contrary to the subject's own interests. This actor instinct is very strong in some people, and this self-mesmerism is far more common than people imagine. It is seen on the stage, and among speakers and writers. Mesmeric subjects. Even many of the best mesmeric subjects who travel around with the professional mesmerists are of this last mentioned class to a certain degree. They are able to throw themselves into the parts, and play them well, so long as they are not adversely affected thereby. They are far different beings from the weak-willed, flabby creatures that are so often seen following around after the professional mesmerists. The imaginative professional subject is alive to his own interests, and as a somewhat cynical friend of mine, who had made a close study of the subject, once said, Even the most obedient subject of this class would utterly fail to act upon the suggestion of his powerful operator to effect that the subject consent to a reduction of his weekly wages paid by the operator, even though the deep stage of hypnotic sleep be produced. Don't surrender your will. But I consider that even this imaginative class of subjects are unwise in allowing themselves to be guided and governed by the suggestions and commands of any operator, for I believe that even such a habit is injurious to the will. The will is a precious thing and should not be prostituted in this way. I cannot urge this too strongly upon my students. I say to them, surrender your will into no one's keeping. Regard it as a woman should her virtue, and allow no one to take liberties with it. Who can exert fascination? The average person possessing self-confidence and force can and does exert mental fascination over others with whom he comes in contact, although it requires a developed will to become an expert in this line of mental work. Besides this, there is undoubtedly a certain knack and technique about the work, which is acquired by practice, although some seem to have it considerably developed naturally. There are geniuses in fascination as well as in art, and there are others who have acquired the mastery in both by careful practice and determination. The requisite for fascination. In considering the qualities that go to make up the person in whom mental fascination is likely to be strongly developed, I may mention the following. 1. Physical well-being. For there is a certain strength about a man or woman in strong, robust health that must be taken into consideration. It is true that some persons not physically well but unhealthy have exercised strong powers of fascination, but this was in spite of their lack of physical health and owing to a strong will which allowed them to master even this obstacle. But, all else being equal, there is a power about a strong, healthy, vigorous person that makes itself felt. 2. Belief in oneself, for without this no one manifests positivity. Believe in your own power and ability, and you impress others with the same belief. Confidence is contagious. Cultivate the I can and I will. 3. Poise. For the calm, well-poised, imperturbable man has an enormous advantage over one lacking these qualities. The man who meets any emergency without losing his head has something about him that makes him looked up to as a natural leader. He has one of the qualities of positivity. Cultivate the calm, masterful mood. 4. Fearlessness. For fear is the most negative emotion in the being of man. Fearlessness is a most positive quality, just as fear is the most negative. Cultivate the I do, I dare. 5. Concentration. For this one-pointedness focuses the willpower upon the object. Do one thing at a time, and do it with all the power there is in you. 6. Fixity of purpose. For you must learn to know what you want to do, and then stick to it until it is done. Cultivate the bulldog quality. It is needed. To those who recognize the need of the above-mentioned qualities but who lack them, I would recommend the careful study and determined application of the principles of mental architecture, as stated in my 7th lesson in my work on Mental Magic, in which the matter is gone into detail with exercises, etc. Nonsense exposed. There has been much nonsense written about who make good subjects, etc., in works upon mesmerism, hypnotism, etc., and many amusing rules for the determination of the degree of impressionability have been given by many writers. Some say that brunettes are the most impressionable, while others assert that blondes yield more readily, etc., etc., but the experienced investigator laughs at such distinctions. Some consider that women make the best subjects, while others assert that men really are more readily influenced. My own opinion is that the percentage is about the same in both sexes. Then again, one must remember that the degrees of impressionability are relative. For instance, A may be positive to B, while B may be positive to C, and so on to the end of the alphabet. And using the same illustration, M is negative to L, though positive to N. Do you see this? A lie nailed. Some writers have tried to make people believe that only strong-minded people may be mesmerized, and give as proof thereof the fact that idiots and insane people are almost immune from hypnotic and mesmeric influence. This is a favorite argument of the professional hypnotists, who use it in order to put at ease their subjects, or possible subjects, who might not wish to appear as weak-minded people. The truth is that the reason that the above classes are exempt is because 1. The idiots have little or no power of attention, and are like mere machines, and consequently cannot be induced to pay attention long enough to be mesmerized. But all advanced students of mental influence know that idiots, as well as animals, may be influenced by mental vibrations or mental waves, etc., by treatment. 2. Insane people are usually carried away with a fixed idea or delusion, and are, in fact, practically in a state akin to that produced by hypnotic or mesmeric process to a marked degree. Their minds are centered on the delusion and cannot be taken off of it. If the attraction could be removed, the patient would no longer be insane, and although the sleep condition cannot well be induced in insane patients, still the best authorities know that such people often yield to strong suggestions and mental treatments to a certain degree, so that the rule does not always hold. Impressionable people. The class of people who yield most readily to the mesmeric influence, outside of the subclass of imaginative people mentioned a few pages further back, are those who have not manifested their will, determination, and self-reliance very much. People who have led a life in which implicit obedience or reliance upon others have been cultivated. These are the people who are the most impressionable. They have not used their wills, and are more readily ruled by the wills of others, or through their emotions. As I have said in my larger work, the degree of response to suggestion by command is to be observed in the highest degree among those who have always depended upon others for orders, or instruction, and have not had to use their own wits and resources in life. Unskilled laborers and the sons of rich men who have had someone to think for them often belong to this class. These people seem to want someone else to do their thinking for them, even in the smallest event of their lives, and are most impressionable along the proper lines. Then the degree of positivity rises as we consider the people who have had to do things for themselves, and who have not depended so much upon others. Positivity is the greatest among people who have had the ordering of others to do, or who have had to depend upon their own resources and their own wits in getting through life. The men of marked initiative have scarcely a trace of this form of suggestibility. Initiative, you know, is a term for doing things without being told, using one's own wits and resources and will. The above applies equally to the subject of impressionability, to mesmeric influence. And what does it all mean when it is boiled down? Just this, that the degree of impressionability depends upon the degree of the lack of will development. The word will is the keynote. And this in spite of all the talk, twaddle, and nonsense written and spoken by those who are interested in having the people appreciate the wonderful virtue of hypnotism. The mob spirit. The reason that mobs allow themselves to be influenced is because they surrender their individuality and individual will and allow it to become merged with the wills of others until a mob will is created, which represents the average of the crowd, the weaker wills diluting the strength of the whole. When this mess of mingled and weakened will is properly mixed, it remains in a dazed and excited condition until some individual springs to the front, some leader of men who has held on to his individual will and impresses his will upon the more negative will of the crowd, and the mob accepts his suggestions and follows like sheep or mesmerized subjects, and does his bidding until some other leader catches its attention and interest. Emotionability. There is another phase of mentality that has its bearing upon the degree of impressionability. I refer to the quality known as emotionability. An emotional person is one who more readily throws off the influence of his own will and reason and gives himself up to the play of the emotional side of his nature. Such a person is more impressionable than one who is not so emotional, but whose will is really no stronger. The reason is that by his mental habits he has accustomed himself to open up his emotive pole of mentality to outside influences, and allowing his motive pole to remain inactive. He allows his feelings to rule him instead of ruling his feelings. He allows his emotional nature to usurp the throne of his will, the latter being relegated to second place. And the consequence is that his emotive nature has become more open to unresisted outside influences and impressions, and responds more readily to the same. It has acquired the impressionable habit. Do you see? This last explanation will throw some light on the fact that certain races of people are far more impressionable than others. They are emotional, that's all. Who is an impressionable? In the following chapters I shall use the term impressionable as a noun, designating a person who is sufficiently impressionable to respond to the influence of a mesmerist or hypnotist to a greater or lesser degree. These impressionables are comparatively easily impressed by the mentative force and suggestions of the experimenter along these lines. Please remember the sense in which I shall use the term. Later on I shall use the term hyper-impressionable as a noun, indicating a person excessively or abnormally impressible by mesmeric influence. The latter class will be further described in the proper place in the book. Let me give you a fanciful illustration of the subject of impressionability. It will form the subject of our next chapter, which will be entitled The Fable of the Mentative Couple. It will explain not only the matter of response to the mesmeric influence, but will also throw light on the exercise of personal mental influence that is going on around us in everyday life, all the time, everywhere. You will have a much clearer idea of the matter after reading this fable, and you will also be much more on your guard because of the lesson taught therein. Do not fail to read it carefully, and seek for the secret contained within its lines. End of chapter 6.
Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson. The Fable of the Mentative Couple. Once upon a time there lived in the land of Mentalvania, in a wonderful building called the Mentative Castle, a man and a woman called the Mentative Couple. They were happy, though married. They lived in harmony because they were useful to one another, and neither was complete without the presence of the other, and neither did his or her best work unless the other was present and assisting. Well now, the man was called Volus, which is the same as the English name will, and the woman was called Emotione, which in the language of that country meant something like the combination of emotion, desire, and imagination. Now the chronicles inform us that these two people had natures entirely different from each other, as has been said. We are told that Volus was of a stern, inflexible, strong, positive nature, apt to stick to a thing once begun, full of the will to live and vitality, full of determination and spirit, with a strong dash of the let me alone and get out of my way in his make-up, with a taste for meeting difficulties and overcoming obstacles, with a goodly degree of habit of reaching out and taking hold of what Emotione wanted and needed, and a powerful lot of self-respect and self-reliance in him. He was apt to be firm, although his firmness was not the stubbornness of the mule, and his general keynote was strength. He was a good warrior and defender of his castle. But Emotione was of an entirely different type, temperament, and character. She was most impressionable, imaginative, emotional, credulous, fanciful, full of desire, curious, sympathetic, and easily persuaded. While Volus was all willing and thinking, Emotione was all feeling. Volus was a strong character, but lacked certain qualities that make for success. But these qualities Emotione possessed, and she supplied the deficiency in Volus. Volus had to figure out everything, while Emotione had intuition, and jumped at a conclusion in a way remarkable to Volus, who couldn't understand the process at all. When he would ask Emotione for an explanation, she would say lightly, "Oh, just because," which answer would often provoke profane and irreverent discourse on the part of Volus. But nevertheless he learned to respect these becauses of Emotione, and found that they helped him in his business. Emotione would dream out things and see things a long way ahead, and then Volus would proceed to put these plans into operation. Volus couldn't see very far ahead of his nose, while Emotione could see miles beyond and years ahead. And besides this faculty of mental imagery that came in so useful in Volus' business, Emotione also possessed a burning and ardent desire for things, which she managed to communicate to Volus, thereby causing him to get out and do things that otherwise he would never have dreamed of doing. Emotione was like fire, and Volus like water. The water would hold the fire in check, but at the same time the fire would heat up the water, and the result would be the steam of action. And so you see, these two, this mentative couple, formed a fine co-partnership and prospered mightily. But alas, the tempter entered Eden, and the attractive stranger meandered in the direction of the Mentative Castle, and when he reached there, trouble occurred. And this is what happened. One day Volus was absent from the castle, being engaged in some arduous enterprise, and consequently the castle was unguarded. Volus had provided against this by instructing Emotione that she was to keep the castle gate closed tight when he was away from home, and never to gaze without in his absence, for there was some mysterious danger looking without when he was away. Emotione had faithfully followed the directions of her liege lord, although her womanly curiosity was piqued thereat. Many the time she had heard the strange knockings at the castle gate, but she heeded them not, and even refrained from looking out of the little peephole in the gate, though this last was much against her inclination, for she could see no harm in just looking. But to return to our tale, this particular day, when Volos was absent from home, her curiosity was too much for Emotione when she heard the strange knocking at the gate, and, breaking her rule, she ventured to peep without. Looking down, she saw a most attractive stranger, with a fascinating smile on his lips. He looked almost as strong as Volos, but he seemed to have a dash of the woman in him. Besides, he had the strength, but also the charm that Emotione recognized as being part of her own nature. "Ah," sighed Emotione, "here is a man who can understand me." The fascinating stranger smiled sweetly, and, looking her in the eyes, masterfully asked to be admitted. "No, no," replied Emotione, "I cannot let you in, for Volos told me not to." "Ah, fair lady," said the stranger softly, "Volos means all right, but he is rather old fogyish and behind the times. He does not understand as do you and I. Pray, let me in." And, like Mother Eve, Emotione took the bait. Well, to make a long story short, when Volos came home, he found that Emotione had subscribed to a set of the Vieux Modern Art, a beautiful work issued by the Deluxe Brothers of Fifth Avenue, to be issued in 824 weekly parts, at the nominal price of $5 a part, 739 parts of which were already out, and would be delivered shortly. She had also given a number of side orders for manifold wares, which had dazzled her untrained and unguarded fancy. Volos cried to the gods of his land, but it was too late. The contracts had been signed. But that was but the beginning. Volos did not understand just what was the matter, and contented himself with scolding Emotione, whereat she wept bitterly. But the poison went on with its deadly work, and when Volos again was absent from home, the habit reasserted itself, and when the fascinating stranger again called at the castle, he was admitted. And when Volos returned, he found the castle furnished from dungeon to watch-tower with costly rugs and furniture, and various other articles bought from Morgenstern's Popular Installment House, at 1,000 down and $100 per week. He also found that the castle had been lightning-rodded from ground to turret on each wing, tower, and annex, and that notes containing a law-proof, judgment-confessed clause had been given in exchange therefor. And then Volos sware by the beard of Mars, the war god, that he would have no more of this. He would remain at home thereafter, and he did. But the subtle stranger was onto the game, in all of its details, and this is how he played it on Volos, even though the latter remained at home. A few days later, after Volos had determined to remain at home, there came a band of mountebanks, singing, dancing, and performing juggling tricks. Volos sat on the great stone beside the open castle gate, and his attention was attracted by the sounds and sights. Faster the dancers whirled, louder beat the drums, sweeter grew the singing, more bewildering grew the feats of jugglery, until poor Volos forgot all about the open castle gate, so rapt was he at the strange sights, sounds, dances, and feats of jugglery. Then one of the mountebank gang, who was really the attractive stranger disguised in motley array, slipped unseen past Volos, and in a moment was engaged in eager conversation with the impressionable Emotione. Volos watched the crowd until it moved away, and then, entering the castle and closing the gate behind him, he was confronted by Emotione in tears, for she dreaded the coming storm. "Alack-a-day! Woe's me!" she cried. "I am again in trouble, O Volos, my liege lord! I have just ordered from the fascinating stranger who slipped past you at the gate a baby grand, self-playing, automatic, liquid air valved radium carburetor harpsichord, upon which I may play for you all classes of music, ranging from Wagner's Götterdämmerung to the popular ragtime air entitled Kiss You, Babe, Goodbye. With feeling, depth of expression, and soulful understanding, according to the words of the fascinating stranger who took my order." "Godzooks!" ejaculated Volos. "Fain would I cry aloud the name of that production of Wagner's just mentioned by thee. And by my halidom, e'en shalt thou soon be singing to me the words of that ragtime melody just quoted by thy false red lips. Zounds! The truth, I have been stung again by that fascinating stranger. I must gaze no more upon these fleeting scenes of merriment and amazement, lest I be again decorated with the ass's ears. Aha! Volos is himself again, and the next time the fascinating stranger appears upon the scene, he shall be smitten hip and thigh with my trusty battle-axe, and my snickersee shall pierce his foul carcass." But alas, even once more was poor Volos deceived and trifled with. Once more was poor Emotione fascinated by the stranger, and it came about in this way. On the day of his last undoing, Volos sat on the open step in front of the narrowly opened castle door. "No man shall pass me now," cried he. But fate willed otherwise, for as he sat there approached many people who took seat upon the steps before the gate, and engaged Volos in long-heated and wearisome discourses regarding the outlook for the crops, the presidential campaign, the Japanese question, race suicide, the new theology, how old was Anne, the problem of the final outcome of the collision between the irresistible force and the immovable body, the canals on Mars, what Roosevelt will do when his term expires, and many other weighty, interesting, and fascinating topics of general interest. Most agreeable were these visitors, and most considerate of Volos' feelings were they, and although they seemed to differ from him at the beginning of each argument, still they courteously allowed him to convince them inch by inch, until they finally acknowledged that he was invincible in argument and invulnerable in logic. "'Tis passing strange," quoth Volos, "but nevertheless 'tis true, that I always find myself on the right side of every question, and the wonder grows when they all admit it in the end. Verily, I am developing into a wise guy." And pondering thus, he fell sweetly asleep from the rigor of his disputes. The flattering attention shown him, the joys of the victory, and the exceeding amount of attention and interest he had expended, for human nature has its limitations, even in the case of one so strong as Volos. And while he slumbered, the fascinating stranger, who was really the leader of the argumentative visiting committee, crept into the house and unloaded upon Emotione a choice collection of gilt-edged mining stock, pure gilt all the way through, in fact, a bunch of flying machine bonds, and 5,000 donkey-power vestibuled drawing-room observation car automobile called the Yellow Peril. And when Volos discovered what had happened, he wept aloud, crying bitterly, "Odds bones, 'sdeath of a cert am I, the Baron E.Z. Mark." And thereupon he sent for the wise man who dwelt in the next barony. The wise man came, and after hearing the story said, "My children, yours is a sad case, but matters may be adjusted without a visit to Sioux Falls, and without the raising of the question of alimony. The trouble is as follows. Volos without emotione has no desire or incentive to do things. He has no wants to satisfy, and therefore does nothing. He needs emotione to supply the desire, and without her he has no feeling. He is nothing but a hard-shell clam. Therefore he needs her to supply the feeling. For verily and of a truth, feeling is the spice of life. And without her he has no imagination, and cannot see beyond the end of his nose. And what is life without imagination? Gadzooks, one might as well be a mummy. And on the other hand, emotione without Volos is a consuming fire of desire, an unrestrained imagination, an intuitive faculty degenerated into the basest superstition, most deplorable credulity, and the idlest fancy. Volos has no desire, emotion, or imagination of his own, and emotione has no will of her own. Verily, cannot it be seen by all that this couple needs one another the worst way? Each alone is but an incomplete half. United they stand, divided they fall. In union alone is there strength for them. And more than this, each without the other falls a prey to the wiles of some fascinating stranger. We have seen how emotione was fascinated and controlled by the will of the stranger who gained access to the castle. But I have also seen, by my magic art, that when Volos was away from home on important business, without having emotione along to keep him straight, he fell a victim to the wiles of the desire and imagination of a fair stranger across the river, and did her bidding, and used his will to perform her tasks, instead of those desired by his own emotione. Verily, art these people quits with one another, and should now begin over again. True it is that harmony will be theirs only when they are together. And this is the secret of the undoing of emotione. Without the will of Volos to protect her, direct her, and advise her, emotione allowed her desire, imagination, and emotion to run wild and unrestrained, and so she became so impressionable as to allow herself to be mastered by the will of the stranger, who took advantage of the same, and gathered to himself many choice orders for things. And even when Volos sat by the door watching the players, dancers, and jugglers, his attention was so centered on what he saw that the fascinating stranger slipped through the gate. It was even as if Volos had been absent from home. And again, when Volos allowed himself to become engaged in weighty discourse with the visiting committee, and used up his energy and force in argument and dispute with them, and when he permitted himself to be jollied into a false security by these united brethren of the Blarney Stone, he relaxed his vigilance, and allowed himself to become tired, drowsy, and sleeping, and so fell into a doze at his post, and the stranger again entered and took emotione's orders for goods. And this, then, is the remedy, as my successor, Lawson of Boston, will say in the centuries to follow. This is the remedy. Each person of this mentative couple must stick close to the other. Volos must have no important business across the river, which will allow emotione to be without a protector and adviser. And emotione must stick close to Volos and satisfy her curiosity, imagination, emotion, and desire by setting him to work out things for her, to do things dreamed of by her, to get her things she desires, to express the things felt by her. This is the secret of success, dear mentative couple. Mutual work by desire and will, working in unison and harmony, each faithful to the other, each guarding the other from the fascinating strangers that beset each when separated. Now then, children, get to work. And saying this, the wise man vanished from sight. And the moral of this fable of the mentative couple is this: that the mind of every man and woman is a mentative castle, wherein dwells a volus and an emotione. And what happened to the couple in the fable may happen and does happen to many in everyday life. The will, straying from home and paying attention to other attractions, leaves the castle unguarded, and the fascinating stranger enters. And again the will has its attention distracted by passing objects of interest, and forgets the castle door. And again the will allows itself to be fatigued, tired, and jollied by useless argument and talk and cogitation at the instigation of the designing, fascinating stranger, and the latter slips past the gate. And in each case, inside the gate is emotione unprotected, and innocent, true to her own nature, credulous, imaginative, fanciful, desireful, and emotional. Is it any wonder that she orders goods that are not wanted by the family? And the remedy of the wise man, as given to the mentative couple, may be, and should be, applied to every man and woman in his or her mental castle. And this, then, is the moral of the fable. End of chapter 7.